The US president says he needs to be involved with choosing Iran's next leader, announcing on social media that he will not accept anyone who continues the policies of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Now, this comes amid reports that Iran's Temporary Leadership Council is preparing to announce a successor. My next guest is Ali Al-Foneh. He's a senior fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute, a political scientist who has focused much of his research on the Islamic Republic. Sir, it's good to have you. Thank you. Donald Trump just told my colleague Dana Bash that installing a new leader is going to work, quote, just like Venezuela. Is that realistic? And if not, why not?
Iran's social media is producing all sorts of amusing AI-generated photos of President Trump wearing the clerical robe and a turban, participating in election of the next leader. The reality, of course, is that Iran is a different type of regime than that of Venezuela. We know that the leadership election process is very much like a papal conclave. It is extremely secluded and secretive, and 88 individuals needed to cast their vote. They probably already have selected a leader, but we do not know the name of that individual, possibly because of the security considerations of the regime. And I am not imagining the regime consulting President Trump concerning who the next leader should be. Right now, the expectation is that the regime has elected the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Mr. Mujtaba Khamenei, to be the next leader of Iran. And this is a message of defiance, but also of continuity. The message is, you kill one Khamenei, we give you another.
I just wonder, given that Axios was the first to report that Trump is demanding a new leader, in that same interview, he reportedly demanded that Israel's president must pardon Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, seeking to simultaneously pick Iran's next leader and shield his war partner from criminal prosecution. Axios writes, does that tell you that Trump wants power across the board in this region?
President Trump, unfortunately, has an ability to offend everyone, both allies and adversaries. And it is deeply humiliating to the people of Israel that he now intervenes in the internal affairs of that country. And it is just as offensive to many people inside of Iran. I suspect even the opposition to the Islamic Republic that the President of the United States wants to have a say concerning who will be the future leader of the country.
I want to ask you about how the country is being run and who's in charge at present. For example, Iran now says that it considers firms across the Gulf that buy US government debt a legitimate target. It is clear now, whether Iran admits it or not, that it is trying to hurt this region of the Gulf economically. It had threatened attacks on US military assets, but these are non-military assets, and these economies are being put under pressure. Is this a strategy that you think can work, or will the Gulf states hold off until Iran pretty much runs out of firepower at this point?
The regime in Tehran is clearly struggling to secure its survival, and it believes that rather than unconditionally surrendering or capitulating to President Trump, it needs to continue negotiations. And some of the actions that we are seeing are their way of negotiating and communicating the message to President Trump that if he wants to overthrow the regime will see to it that everybody goes down and will do great harm to the global economy and, of course, also to the US economy. They believe that one of the few soft spots or one of the few vulnerabilities of President Trump is the price of gas at the gas stations here in America. So they are doing their best and utmost to drive up the price of oil. And once President Trump decides to negotiate again rather than pursuing a regime change policy, Iran will be in a better position to continue negotiations.
Talk to anybody around this region, they say even if they do get back to the negotiating table, they are a much weakened, they are in a much weakened position, of course. So I want you to stand by. I want to get your thoughts on the Kurdish people potentially launching an uprising in Iran. US President Trump says that he would be, quote, all for it. Let's just remind our viewers that the Kurds make up 8 to 17% of Iran's population, as we hear now from my colleague, CNN's Clarissa Ward.
Everyone is watching to see whether Kurdish fighters will launch a ground offensive into Iran. So who are the Kurds? They're one of the largest stateless ethnic groups in the world, about 30 to 40 million people spread across a mountainous region spanning Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire a century ago, they were promised a state of their own. It never materialized. In Iran, Kurdish armed groups have fought the government for decades, operating from bases along the Iraqi border. Multiple sources say the CIA has backed some of those groups as they prepare for a possible ground offensive. In Iraq, the picture is very different. Kurds here built a powerful autonomous region after the fall of Saddam Hussein and worked closely with the United States in the fight against ISIS. But they're wary of provoking Iran and are trying to stay neutral, calling for peace and stability. In Syria, Kurdish militias became one of Washington's most effective partners against ISIS, controlling much of the northeast. But they were ultimately forced to give up some of that territory to the government in Damascus. Across the region, Kurdish politics and loyalties vary widely, but many share a long history of struggle for recognition, autonomy, and in some cases, their own state. Clarissa Ward, CNN, Erbil.
So, Ali, with that context in mind, you've said a Kurdish incursion would amount to civil war with Iran's territorial integrity at stake. Your thoughts on how likely this scenario is and how it might play out?
President Trump is unfortunately trying to force the Kurdish government of Iraq and more precisely the Kurdish Iranian opposition based on the Iraqi side of the border to take action, military action against the central government in Tehran. And I suspect that even though the Islamic Republic is a deeply unpopular regime, the threats and the risk of a civil war and partition of the country will actually mobilize the people to support the regime. An unpopular regime, which is to be preferred to a devastating civil war in northwestern parts of Iran. These, particularly the cities, have a mixed population. Such a war would be a disaster, a humanitarian catastrophe for Iran.
Ali, it's good to have you. Important insight. Thank you.